Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Cloud Native Now podcast. I'm your host, Mike Vizard, and once again with Paul Nashawaty, practice lead for application development for the Futurum Group. Paul, good to see you again.
Mike, great to be here.
Well, we had a little surprise. IBM turned around and bought a company called Kubecost. And is there something going on with expenses these days in Kubernetes and trying to bring this under control that a company the size of IBM would feel the need to go buy a tiny little outfit like Kubecost?
Yeah, it's a great move in my opinion for IBM because, when we look at the adoption of cloud modernization and cloud native adoption in general, container cost management is a factor, right? And without having a pure kind of understanding of the activities that are going on with your refactoring of applications, utilizing containers is a big part of that, right? So we often have this conversation whether or not, heritage applications need to be refactored at all. And then once they are decided to be refactored, there's usually a challenge of getting it refactored, but there's also an after effect that says, oh, well, now that we refactored it, it's costing X amount of dollars to run it. So having Kubecost as part of the mix allows to do IBM's FinOps approach prior to the refactoring conversation. So adding in FinOps into cloudability and turbonomics allows for that real kind of approach on, determining what the costs are going to be for containerization as well as your heritage applications. So I think it's a great move. I mean, I think it's a good move to kind of expand, especially when we see in our own research that 43% of organizations have 30 to 60% of their production applications in containers. I think it's an important understanding of what those containers are what it costs to run those containers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you and I were both on the TechStrong gang earlier this week, and we were talking about the fact that there's a tension in the system. Developers want to have the most amount of resources available and will naturally over-provision, even though theoretically Kubernetes is supposed to scale things up and down for them dynamically, and we shouldn't have this issue. But here we are. So do we need to kind of figure out a way to automate this whole FinOps motion as it applies to Kubernetes especially and its complexity? So are we on the cusp of some fundamental change where maybe the controls for finance are embedded in the DevOps workflows for managing the cloud native environment?
Well, I mean, if you look at Kubecost's customer base, they have 12,000 people plus that are running, Kubecost, right? So those 12,000 organizations feel a need to understand what's going on with their cost spending for container management. Automation of it absolutely would be the next step. I think having a simple approach to say, almost like a calculator that says, here's what the factors would be to do refactoring, entering the formula, and it produces a result. That is what several of these kind of FinOps solutions are doing today. But I think a full automation of FinOps and a full automation of understanding what's going on with the environment, it's still a ways away. I would say probably, just roughly looking at just some data that I pulled from, I would say roughly 10% or less of organizations that are doing modernization efforts are ready for an automated FinOps solution.
Well, cost has been a recurring theme as of late, and we just saw Docker Inc. has changed its subscription model, and if you look at it on paper, it's like a 40% hike, but we're talking about the difference between $5 to $9 and $9 to $14, and some people are saying, well, that's the cost of a latte. What's your take on it? What is the impact of this price increase, and are we getting more value for money because, well, there's more bundled in that subscription?
Yeah, Mike, this is a good kind of conversation. I met with the Docker team and we went into kind of a lot of detail around this. I think with the acquisition of Atomic Jar last year really was a kind of a great move, especially with test containers, right? Bringing the whole testing into the CI/CD pipeline and putting out Docker Build Cloud as well as Docker Scout to kind of complement all that. This price increase really is a simpler way to roll out the suite of products, right? It's incorporating all these different tech stack that goes within the Docker Pro subscription. Yeah, they moved from not $5 to $9, which is a significant increase. But the bigger factor here to consider is you don't have to have all these different components individually configured. It's part of the suite now, which is a nice way to kind of simplify the deployment across the Docker Hub. Which I think is really attractive to developers because they can turn on and turn off services as they need them without having to worry about, bringing on another part of provisioning and getting the cost to download it and such. This is all part of the same platform. So I think it's a good move. I think that the developers will look at it as a faster time to value, so to speak, for their applications because they don't have to worry about a different change in their environment. But let's kind of really dissect it. When you look at what organizations are actually going to be hit with, it's roughly on the average about a $400 per month increase, or $4,800 per year increase. But in turn, you're getting all this value of frictionless access to Scout, to build cloud, to test containers. It's all part of the CI/CD pipeline. It's all part of the platform. So if your organization is all in with Docker, this is a seamless way and easier way to deploy.
I'm working a pet theory that says that AI is going to force this issue anyway. And what we're seeing is the silos between all these different tools are starting to collapse. And I'm going to create these automated workflows. And I don't really want to have an automated workflow that spans multiple processes being hung up because there are different SKUs for each of these tools and processes. So I think we're kind of looking at this as a much larger wholesale trend that's going to occur across all these software development life cycles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're spot on. I mean, that's part of the reason why Docker is instituting or pushing out for a GA announcement in November of Docker Insight dashboard, right? And that's going to give the ability to see what's happening across the workflows. And it's it's currently in preview right now, but it's definitely something to consider for cloud native developers. And again, to your point, it's going to streamline the process.
Docker Inc. also puts forward this notion of this inner loop, which implies that there's an outer loop. And there's a story on DevOps.com that takes issue with the whole notion of inner loops versus outer loops and says it's kind of an antiquated way of thinking about things. But how should we be thinking about software development life cycles in the age of containers and microservices and Kubernetes? Does that loop metaphor still work?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it from the context of the SDLC as an infinity loop, right, that's continuous, and the agile development processes of continuously improving your product and your application as you're pushing it out the door. Yeah, I think that that's still a valid way to look at the SDLC. I think that if you don't have some type of call it some type of loop or some type of way to kind of do this across the pipeline, where do you stop the continuous improvement piece? So I think that loop helps with that continuous improvement. I think that that's a valuable way to drive results and very quickly to put your application out the door.
Yeah, I'm just not sure. The loop itself, if you take it apart, you could just run it straight in a linear line and it would show you the same thing. So I'm a little sometimes scratching my head going, do we just make it a loop to make it fit on a chart, or is it just kind of like, look, the reality of the situation is we do different things at different times based on the task at hand?
Well, I think that goes back to whether you're running an agile software development methodology or you're running waterfall, right? If you're running waterfall, then you have a continuous line and you have milestones and you meet those points and then you deliver and then you're done. With the agile software methodology, it is meant to be continuous. So that's why it is meant to be a loop.
Yeah. Speaking of the software and development lifecycle, there's been some news out of JFrog that affects the cloud native community. And let's go first with the big names. But JFrog aligned with NVIDIA. They connected their Artifactory to the repositories that NVIDIA makes available for microservices that they call NIM. I think that stands for something, but nobody seems to remember what. But there's also these pre-trained artifacts that NVIDIA makes available as containers as well. How are these cloud native workflows and AI models coming together from your perspective?
Well, I think JFrog's alignment with NVIDIA is powerful. I think it makes sense in the AI world. I think that the registry, the Artifactory or registry that kind of goes with JFrog really is part of that development lifecycle, development process. So having JFrog kind of have an alignment with NVIDIA only helps build or solidifies the AI application. So if you're looking at the running AI applications within production, I think if you've listened to any one of my sessions previously, I've made the point of saying that 18% of production applications 9 months ago were running AI. We ran that study 9 months later, and now we see that 54% are running AI in production applications. So I think JFrog is smart to kind of get involved with this because it's part of that process, but it also allows for to add the APIs into the whole process, so you have the ability to manage the applications using the JFrog model registry.
JFrog talks a lot about the melding of DevOps and MLOps. Is that happening from your perspective, and what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at MLOps and DevOps, I think MLOps is part of one of the deliverables or one of the parts of DevOps. I don't think it's separate from. I think it's no different than understanding how it can most effectively incorporate MLOps and DevOps together to meet those business KPIs. If you're driving towards results and you have to have a specific actionable insights or specific uptime or service level objective that your business is driving towards, having the ability to do so through DevOps and using MLOps to kind of get you there makes a lot of sense to me. It's a tool, it's an enabler for success. It's not call it a means to an end, but it's also part of the whole the workflow that you would put together as part of your delivery process.
It also feels like Kubernetes has kind of become the default platform for building and deploying a lot of these AI applications. Are these two things becoming joined at the hip? Because if I don't put them in containers, they're too unwieldy to build, and but then they're in multiple containers, and I need to orchestrate that.
Yeah, so I think I'll take what you said, kind of break it apart into two sections. One, microservices and containerization absolutely is the preferred method for creating any net new application. I mean, it's just the cloud elasticity, taking advantage of cloud native applications, absolutely makes a lot of sense. Kubernetes then adding in the orchestration layer to manage the pods of these applications and these containers, you need some way to manage it, right? So having the ability to have Kubernetes or do the orchestration of the containers makes a lot of sense. Building net new applications in containers and microservices makes a lot of sense. And combining those two things together, obviously for AI applications, allows you to scale and grow dynamically and fluidly much faster than you would be able to do so on a monolithic application. So I think that makes, from my perspective, it makes sense to utilize containerization, and of course utilize Kubernetes to do the orchestration of those containers for those AI apps.
All right. JFrog, of course, has been up to some other things. They have a runtime platform now, and they're making a case for pushing responsibility for application security both further left and right. And the idea here is that, at least on Kubernetes clusters where it works, that I'll be able to scan and identify security issues in the runtime environment that will then feed back to the JFrog tools for remediating and scanning for vulnerabilities at the far left, in terms of at the point at least where developers are writing the code. Is this the right approach to DevSecOps? I feel like so much of what we've talked about for the last few years has been shift left, and this feels a little more like shift right and left.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that when I look at where organizations are, what this announcement really does is allows organizations to continuously analyze the workflows and workloads, as well as analyze the Kubernetes clusters in real time as cloud native applications environments are put together, and they can be done dynamically, right? This is something that's not just a shift left. This is definitely a shift left, shift right, like you're saying. But it's also management of those environments holistically across the entire ecosystem. So I think that that makes a lot of sense. I think that if you look at what a lot of organizations are spending, they're roughly spending about $500-600 per week per application developer on security related or DevSecOps tasks, right? This is a way to kind of overcome some of those challenges, right? And I think that that's a good move to move it closer to an automated approach. But then also, really, what's it made for is to block those vulnerabilities that are caught by DevSecOps. So I think it's a much better way to incorporate your CVE into your environment.
And speaking of security, there's a story on Cloud Native Now talking about how distributed denial of service attacks are kind of seeking out cloud native applications. I mean, they've been after cloud applications for a long time, but a lot of the cloud native applications have different characteristics, and in theory, at least, you should be able to reroute API calls if something becomes unavailable. But do we think that through, and are the bad guys about to disrupt our little happy microservices universe?
Well, I mean, I think that it makes sense to have a redundant architecture. So in the event that something does happen like that, there's an alternate path to get through to the right results there. Look, I mean, I think that there's always going to be a challenge with security, and there's always going to be bad actors out there that are trying to break in and do what they do. But at the end of the day, the things that we can do to kind of put measurements in front of it to prevent it is probably more important in my mind than capture it after it happens. So I think that if we can put those measurements in place to understand how these things occur and block that from occurring in the first place, we won't have to deal with the resolution at the end on the back end.
All right, Paul, thanks for joining me for the latest edition of, shall we call it, As the Cloud Native World Turns.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for all watching the latest episode of the Cloud Native Now podcast, and we enjoyed presenting it to you. You can find this episode on Spotify and all your favorite channels, as well as our website, Cloud Native Now. We invite you to check that out. Until then, we'll see you next time.